Hello, curious minds, and welcome to the third episode of the HEAS podcast. My name is Victoria, and I'm your host, and I'm happy and thrilled to be back with yet another episode on human evolution and archaeology. Before diving into the episode, I want to say something. I want to thank you guys for your so constructive and also very much positive feedback on the last episode. I'm really happy to hear that you enjoyed listening to the stories of our guests, but you also liked the intro and my cats. So thanks for that. I'm happy always to hear back from you with input, ideas, with whatever you would suggest. So don't hold back. You can always send us feedback to the email info.heas@univ.ac.at. I'll put that into the show notes. You can also go to our Instagram, which is @HEASVienna, or well, I guess that's it. I'm glad to see and hear that you enjoyed the last episode, but I would like to make this episode even better. So I need you to provide me with input. If you're listening on Spotify, if you scroll down a bit, you will find a poll and a question. And I would like to know from you guys what you enjoy more. Would you like to hear more personal stories and insights, some chit chat from our researchers, and maybe from my side as well? Or should we keep it more strictly to the scientific side of things? So please, every feedback is welcomed and appreciated. Please answer the question below if you're listening on Spotify. Otherwise, as I mentioned, send us an email or go to our Instagram. Thank you so much. But now, let's talk about this episode, shall we? We have got an exciting lineup for you today. We're joined by two archaeologists, Emily Hallinan and Stefano Campana, as well as by a public health anthropologist, Ainash Childebayeva. Let's start with Emily. Sitting down with Emily was such a pleasure. She was so energetic, and you could really see that she's so passionate about her work. Let me tell you a bit about her before I get too excited over here. So Emily is a postdoctoral researcher at the Interdisciplinary Center for Archaeology and Human Evolution in Portugal. Her research interests are lithic technology and landscape use in the Southern African Stone Age. We do chat about Emily's open-air fieldwork in South Africa, how she became a children's book author, and again, I would like to congratulate on that, Emily, and her potential future plans on opening up a gin distillery in the future. I'm sure you will enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Next up, we have Ainash Childebayeva. She is working at the unique intersection of public health and biological anthropology. This was particularly interesting to me because I've never met somebody who studied these both fields. She's working as an assistant professor at the University of Kansas and as a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany. Ainash led us in on her work at high altitudes in the Peruvian mountains, and she talks about hiking up Mount Everest with a group of study participants and how she was inspired early on in her childhood to become a researcher by her grandma, who was a doctor. I know I say that a lot, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I really enjoyed chatting with Ainash. It felt so familiar. I made some Christmas cookies because at that time it was still mid-December. It felt like, having a conversation with a friend over some Christmas cookies and then maybe chatting a bit about your work. So it was so natural, and Ainash was such a good time. I really enjoyed having this interview as well. And last but not least, we have Stefano Campana, who is a professor of landscape archaeology at the University of Siena in Italy. His research focuses on understanding past landscapes from late prehistory to contemporary times. Stefano talks about why he thinks that landscape archaeology is such an important field. And he shares insights into the role of satellite spy images from the Cold War, which were involved in the discovery of new archaeological Roman sites. And then he tells us about a close encounter with a venomous snake in Iraq. Talking to Stefano was such a good time because you could really feel his passion and his love for what he does. And he also speaks so highly and lovely about his family, which I personally think is such a good trait. So I think that Stefano is such a good addition to this episode. So overall, I'm sure you're going to enjoy this mix of people that we brought in for this episode. And you're going to learn a lot. That also applies to me. I mean, I'm learning such a lot of new information during every conversation that I'm having. And while editing, I'm re-listening to that. So I'm taking it in even further. So thank you to my 3 speakers again. Thank you for teaching me so much. And I'm really excited for you to listen to this episode. So, my dear listeners, sit back, relax. This drink in my hand might or might not be a glass of wine. I'll leave that up to your imagination. Enjoy this conversation. And as always, stay curious, stay engaged, and welcome to the HEAS podcast. Welcome, Emily, to the HEAS podcast. So before we dive into our discussion, would you mind introducing yourself briefly and giving our listeners an overview of your research interests?
Hi, I'm Emily Hallinan. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Interdisciplinary Centre for Archaeology and Evolution of Human Behaviour, otherwise known as ICAREB, at the University of Algarve in Portugal. And I specialise in stone tools and particularly in arid environments in Africa. And recently I've started to look at stone artefact sites from outside of Africa.
I think before we get into more specific questions, let's take a look at the timeline of African Stone Age archaeology. Can you tell us the main time periods of the African Stone Age and give us their corresponding date ranges for a little orientation?
So Africa is a really interesting place to start because it's where we think where modern humans evolved. And the earliest stone tool sites are all in Africa, and many of these are in East Africa, in the East African Rift Valley sort of area. And we actually have the oldest stone tools at about 3 million years ago at a site called Lemekwi. That's a relatively recent addition to our understanding of stone tools. Previously, we thought they went back to sort of mid 2.5 million. So we really don't know how much deeper into time it might go. So that's the start of the Stone Age, as we generally sort of call it. We have the early Stone Age, this earlier phase before we were modern humans. And then around 300, 250,000 years ago, we start to see changes in the fossil record and in the stone tool record that suggest there were some big changes in our evolution. And we call this period the Middle Stone Age. And this continues in different parts of Africa until different time frames. In South Africa, where I do most of my research, the end of Middle Stone Age and the transition to the later Stone Age is around 40 to 30,000 years ago. But it's very variable, and it's very difficult to date a lot of these sites because you can't directly date stone tools like you can other organic remains.
We're going to get to that in a minute because that was actually one of our follower questions, how you date these surface finds. But before that, you said our first evidence on stone tools is around 3 million years ago. And who produced them?
That's a really good question. And I'm not an evolutionary anthropologist, so it's a little bit beyond my specialism. But I think what it raised, when the further back in time we go, it challenges actually us to think about the cognitive capabilities of earlier human ancestors. I think Homo habilis was handyman, as it was called, used to be thought of as the first tool maker. But things have changed a lot since then. But there are a number of problems we have. First of all, it's the sparsity of fossils in the fossil record, especially during this time period. But now we think, based on the dates and the associated fossils, that it was probably pre-Homo as our genus, and it was some sort of Australopithecus that was making stone tools, which really challenges the notion of actually what defines us as a genus and what defines humans and our ancestors. So they're questions a bit beyond my research field, but it's always a bit scary to think about the bigger picture of actually what we're studying and how these behaviors emerged.
It's really interesting to zoom out a little and think about who else produced or might have produced stone tools. And as the first evidence is dating back to 3 million years ago, it's not only us who are the smartest and also, the cognitive abilities of these people, or whatever you want to call them. Yeah, it's actually insane to think. I saw that you're specifically interested in the Middle Stone Age, and the Middle Stone Age is often referred to as the muddle in the middle because, as you said, it's very difficult to date these periods, but I think especially that part in the middle. And it's difficult to define where it starts and where it exactly ends. And this time period goes hand in hand with some of the major advances in becoming anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. Could you tell us more about that time period and which factors contributed to this process of becoming what we define as modern humans?
So again, very broad sort of time frame and concepts, big concepts to try and grapple with. So it was actually the Middle Stone Age in South Africa that captured my interest as an undergrad, and I'd already visited South Africa, and I knew that I wanted to work on Middle Stone Age sites there. I think probably the aspect of the Middle Stone Age that most people have heard about is from these amazing coastal cave sites in South Africa, like Blombos, Pinnacle Point, Diepkloof, Classies River, and slightly inland and further to the east, Sibudu, where it's really turned on its head how we view the behavior of our earlier human ancestors. And that's it's not just stone tools that we're finding there, it's these very complex sort of behaviors that we might describe as art and symbolism, and these are the words that get used a lot. And it's these, when people are making beads or scratching patterns on things, you can really engage with that at a human level. It's something that really does set us apart from animals and other ape relatives today. How many of these behaviors were actually practiced by other human species is very difficult to say. Especially gets controversial with Neanderthals, and I don't want to go into it, but Homo naledi.
Right.
But it really does speak to how we, and particularly also how the public, not just as us as specialists, as archaeologists, really engage with this time period in our past, and it becomes so much more enticing when you're thinking about people like us. So the Middle Stone Age is maybe not necessarily the first time that these behaviors happen, but what these coastal cave sites in particular in South Africa really have preserved is evidence of these behaviors in a deep stratified sequence with dates. And that's what's been critical for really integrating these behaviors into the human story.
And also during that time period, I think is when the techno-complexes, so the way how these people made the stone tools changed, right? Could you tell us more about that?
So that's partly a factor of the resolution we have in studying these things. So what these coastal caves have given us is narrower time slices and within the limits of new dating techniques. So OSL dating was really quite revolutionary in being able to date these pre-radiocarbon deposits. And it's, I guess, the big interest in this period focused in on the Still Bay techno-complex, which I think is probably what you're referring to, that started maybe around 80,000 years ago, followed perhaps by a technological shift, but then another shift to the Howissens-Poort. And they have very distinctive stone tool types, and they are periods where we find a lot of these exciting beads, art, bone points, sort of really tangibly human things.
One of your research projects was investigating stone tool technology in the Tankwa Karoo in South Africa. And the Tankwa Karoo is one of the most arid parts of South Africa. And what did you learn from your research project there? I'm specifically asking about this because I looked at your website and it's very informative. I learned a lot also about surface finds and how many there are and what you can do with that. So that's why I'm asking you, what did you learn from this project? And how did past human populations adapt to these arid environments?
So my impetus for looking at the Tanqua Karoo, I'd spent my master's research working in the Cederberg Mountains, which is in quite close proximity to a number of dated, stratified and well-studied sites. So what I was able to do is use very clearly defined artifact types and technologies that we could associate with different time periods, and not just in the Middle Stone Age. Throughout I did the whole thing from the early Stone Age to the later Stone Age, on the basis that I was looking at how people used the landscape over time based on surface finds. And we could use these different technologies as anchor points into the regional cave sequences. And so in the Cederberg, where it was quite well studied and we had dates to tie these to, I was able to kind of tell a story of how over the past million years people were moving across the landscape differently and doing different things in different places broadly. But my sort of the itch I wanted to scratch was what happens over the other side of the mountains. So you've got the coast to one side, and there are a lot of ideas about mobility and using coastal resources. But actually, very few people had actually thought about what happens on the other side of the mountains. And it's in this part of South Africa, there are two very distinct biomes. So the Fynbos biome is world-renowned for its biodiversity. But there's another very biodiverse area. It's called the succulent Karoo biome on the other side of these mountains. And this unique climate caused by various ocean systems and the effects of some mountains that sort of buffer these zones means that you have this little arid basin with a change in geology. So the rocks available to people for tool making would have been different, and the vegetation responded differently to climate. So it would have offered humans living in the Cederberg Mountains, if they were able to move into the interior, it would have offered them a rather different sort of set of resources to exploit. And if you think about within a year, within the seasonal variations, there might have been something drawing them into the interior. So that was the impetus. It was a big risk because no one had done any research there before. I think someone had done a survey in the 80s and said it was rather futile, which didn't fill me with confidence. But within a couple of days of running around the landscape with my colleague Matthew Shaw, we had already started to learn the patterns of where we were finding things. And something that archaeologists don't like surface assemblages because you can't date them. Very rare cases that you can date them. But the thing with South Africa that very few people who haven't been there, and actually many people who do go there, don't realize is that there is so much surface archaeology. It's a playground for the archaeologists. You can barely go on a hike without tripping over a stone tool. And it's when you start to think about human behavior horizontally rather than vertically, it makes you see the landscape in a totally different way. And actually, people didn't just live in caves. You had to leave your cave to go and catch your eland or gather your plants, or collect your rock for stone tool making. So actually, when you start to view the landscape totally differently, you're asking different questions because you don't have this chronological resolution, but you see these. If you look at maps showing archaeological sites, they're always empty because you don't have secure dates and people are scared of them. Archaeologists are scared of them conceptually. So I think although there were a number of limitations to working in this environment, it was absolutely fascinating to uncover the huge amount of human stone tool debris that's left there in an area it's pretty inhospitable and sparsely populated today still.
I think for us as Europeans or as people living in an area where there are many buildings and everything, we cannot even think about a surface that is like untouched still and where you can still find such a plethora of artifacts. I also found this interesting fact on your website. It was a study that calculated the volume of stone artifacts for the whole of Africa, which equals, and now listeners pay close attention, which equals the stone volume of 84 million Great Pyramids of Giza. 84 million. How's that possible?
It sounds insane. This is a study by Rob Foley and Marta Lara in Cambridge. Yeah. And actually the sort of impetus behind doing this slightly bonkers but scientifically grounded calculation was that they were working in, I think it was after their work in Libya, where they were again working in this barren, vast landscape that has very little one would expect there to be very little archaeology there, but they were tripping over stone tools. And it's this, we become so focused on the areas that are easily accessible, the areas that we can see people living, and maybe we get biased towards sort of the archaeology of later civilizations and people. But actually, if you think about the enormous size of Africa, and I think that's what they're getting at, is we've been using stone tools for 3 million years, and they run a number of scenarios based on sort of the average number of stone tools someone would produce in a day. And I mean, these numbers are a bit beyond me. I can't do numbers at that scale. But conceptually, you're right. It's one of these really kind of what this is mad.
A what moment.
I think it's fascinating to just stop and think about. 99% of human history, we've been using stone for tools. And I mean, we don't make our tools today. So it's just a different world.
Completely. Compared to European archaeology, when you go to an excavation in a cave, you're praying basically to uncover some stone tools. And then when I looked at the pictures from Africa, just the surface, it's like crowded. It's covered. Probably not everywhere, and there are differences, but from what I saw there, it was spectacular. All right. You've also co-authored on a children's book named The Time Trackers about the Tankwa and about the archaeology there. Can you tell us more about the inspiration behind creating it and the book in general?
Thank you for asking about this. This has been a recent project this year, but it's arisen out of more than 10 years working in South Africa. And I've worked with a children's author called Leslie Beek, and she runs a non-profit organization for children in various underprivileged areas of particularly the Western Cape, but beginning to work more broadly. And South Africa is experiencing a reading crisis. 7 out of 10 children can't actually read for meaning, so they can sound out the letters, but they can't understand the words, and not in any language, not even in their first language. So Children's Book Network's main mission is to get children excited about reading, give them access to books that are relevant for them. It's no good for them having, secondhand European books. It's just not relevant to their lives. And it's got me thinking. We've done a lot of sort of visits and chats to people in schools in the Tankwa in particular. These are children who've never gone to Cape Town, never gone to a different town other than the one that lives close by and that they live close by to, and they're even 100 kilometers from that. So their worldview is very different, and it means that the sorts of books that they do have access to are maybe not so relevant to their lives. And so we wanted to communicate a bit about, and we've noticed that in chatting to them, they're really excited about learning what's in their landscape, and also learning how their landscape is special. Why should a researcher based in England or now Portugal, why am I going there to play with the rocks in their garden? So it's been a very encouraging environment to get excited about archaeology in. And so with Leslie, who writes the most beautiful books, we've been planning it for a while, but I said, no, we've just got to do it. We were planning to go to the Tankwa to share the book with the local community there. We did a week of touring around with it. And so Leslie's known me for a long time, and she's heard all the trials and tribulations of doing field work and the sort of imaginings that we can't really do in science, but it's so important to think about what people were doing. Who were the people, the actual people doing these things, not this sort of theoretical ancient humans. And so Leslie's written this story that ties together both the story of 3 archaeologists, loosely based on my team, and our sort of thought processes, our methods, told through the eyes of a girl who lives on the farm called Tana, and it's the sort of questions that she asks, and they're the sort of questions that 12-year-olds in South Africa might be wondering. So she tells the story through the eyes of Tana, through the eyes of the archaeologists, named Emma. There's no resemblance to me at all. And also, I think perhaps the most fascinating of all is imagining how the people who used the tools, what they were thinking, what their experience of the landscape was. So it's told through the eyes of these 3 girls who live in the same landscape in different time periods. And it's all united with some stone tools, which we're working with the Museum of Stone Tools, which is a really cool initiative. They're sharing 3D models of stone tools online. And there are 5 artifacts that we've picked that sort of link through the story. And in fact, when I was working with the schools in the Tankwa this past summer, we gave them these copies to hold, because we can't really take them the real artifacts. It's just, we can't leave them there and things. But that they could see the size, they could feel the pointiness, and sort of start to imagine the past and the people living in their landscape. And I think they were they see stones everywhere, but actually it's given them a new sense of there's more to their landscape than just stones, and also the role that they play and their heritage plays in telling the story of humans in South Africa.
I mean, I'm very fascinated by your research, but especially also about this part, the way you create the outreach, because I think we as scientists are responsible to make the science or like the knowledge we're achieving accessible to other people that are not like, that are interested. But reading a paper, sometimes even for me, I'm like, okay, I'm done after like 30 minutes. So I love the way that you created this, and also to include the people from where we're going to excavate. And as you said, why is this European woman coming to Africa and playing with our stone tools? It's amazing. Do you want to tell us about where to purchase this book so our listeners can go there and get it?
So we self-published it through Amazon in order to maximize the profits, because all of the money goes back to support the work of Children's Book Network. And on my website, you can find out more about the projects that CBN is doing. And it's a really great way to kind of work with people who know what the needs of South Africa are and their children are, and integrate into broader projects there. So this is sort of a spin-off of other projects that CBN is working on. But it was the proof of concept that there is a need for this book. People wanted to hear about it. The children loved it. So yeah, you can purchase it through Amazon, but actually the better way to do it is to follow a link that you will share. And you can email me and I can send you a copy directly, and that cuts out Amazon's profits.
Even better. Do you want to show the book?
Yes, am I showing it the right place?
Perfect. All right. I'm going to put the link into the show notes so people go there. Of course. Now let's move on to our follower questions that I collected from Instagram. So I love this first question. We touched upon it briefly, but it says, many people seem to associate tool making with Homo sapiens and Homo sapiens only. Could you please debunk this?
Right. Well, that's very easy, because I mean, even if we're just talking in Europe, let's say Neanderthals, they were prolific stone tool makers. And they were making very similar stone tools to modern humans were in Africa. I mean, things get a bit more complex later on in time when modern humans enter Europe, and things get funky. That's not my speciality. But I think the first groups of people out of Africa, maybe I shouldn't use the word people, it gets very tricky to know how to describe early humans who had some of they were upright walking, they could manipulate things into tools. Stone tools are only the things that preserve, but potentially they were using bone. There was a fascinating paper from Zambia that they were making quite complex wooden structures. And so I think you have to remember how biased we are by what preserves, especially in unburied sites. Stone is about the only durable thing that's going to last or be recognizable in terms of something that people have used. So yes, I mean, I think as I've said, the earliest stone tools are dated to about 3 million. And if you disagree with that, at least sort of 2.7, 2.5 million. We're in the multi-millions. And right. If modern humans only emerge around 200, 300,000 years ago, there's a huge amount of time. In terms of who made them, that's really a question for the fossil guys to fill in some more gaps in our evolutionary tree. But I think, yeah, it's very easy to debunk that one.
How do you date surface finds without the archaeological layer surrounding them?
It's very tricky to date surface assemblage, as you say, without the context. So usually archaeologists date the sediments that things are buried in, or associated organic material that gives you another thing in that layer to date, because stone is very difficult to date. There are a number of techniques that you can use on stone. A lot of them are destructive, so we tend not to use them. But actually, I think we're getting to the point now where surface finds are becoming more and more accepted as being components of the story, as in our human story, and the material remains from it. And it's getting harder to just ignore these areas and say, well, they're not dated, so they don't count. Obviously, there are limits to how you can interpret these things. It's a broader picture. But there are new techniques related to optically stimulated luminescence dating, which dates quartz grains, and potentially one might be able to date the inside of stone artifacts. So there are a number of techniques, and researchers are more and more doing experimental kind of trying out new approaches. And I'm hoping that working with some new colleagues in South Africa, we're going to try some of these and see if we can bring a bit more chronology to our very horizontal landscape.
You're doing fieldwork in the desert. How do you bring all these stone tools home, or are you analyzing them in situ?
This is the thing. So we don't move anything. We leave everything where we find it. And so I did surveys for looking at open sites for my master's and my PhD. We didn't remove a single artifact. We take photographs of it. We mark them with GPS points. And then more recently, when I've been doing 3D scanning work, particularly intensively at my site of Tweefontein in the Tankwa Karoo, we would put a flag in, and everything was numbered and marked very precisely. We'd lift the artifact, we'd scan it, we'd do our measurements and other attributes, photograph it, and then we put it back exactly in the same place. And part of the idea is that I don't like the idea that things are in boxes in museums. They need to be out in the wild. But also, something that I benefited from a lot was in the 1980s, people had done surveys and they'd left things where they found them. Sure, people pick things up and they don't put them down exactly where they were, but that doesn't mess things up too much. So I feel quite strongly that we shouldn't be taking things away if we can do the analyses in situ, and that's broadly what we're able to do. So yeah, I don't have them in museums, but what we're doing with the 3D scans is we will be making all of these, once we've done our research, we'll be making them all open access so that anyone can download them either to study or to print on a 3D printer. And that's precisely part of the link with the time trackers, having these artifacts that people can view online or print and hold.
And what do you use to scan them in the field?
I have a 3D scanner. She's called Hannah the Scanner because we travel a lot, so I had to give her a name. We've gone all over the world, and it's a little bit limiting in terms that we have to. She works better.
How big is Hannah?
There's a picture on my website, but it's a sort of it's a box. It's a box that sort of works a bit like a barcode scanner, and we put it up on a tripod, and it uses pulses of it. Yeah, it's a bit like a barcode. It shines light onto it. It's not lasers like some scanners, but it shines light, and it basically measures the shape of the object, and it creates a cloud of points where the light hits the object. So it takes around 15 minutes, 20 minutes per artifact, and you have to capture it in all orientations. We have a few limitations in that it works better in darker conditions. We have to be able to control the light a bit. But I've now got a database of nearly 2,500 artifacts I've scanned in South Africa, in Israel, in Oman, in museums. So yeah, it's a great tool, and the wonderful thing is that no one will have to take my word for it with these measurements and all the other analyses we'll be doing over the next couple of years. We can make everything available open access.
All right, last follow-up question. I like that. That has never happened to me, but in case it happens to anybody, listen here. What do you do upon stumbling on a stone tool in the wild? Take it to the next museum or leave it? I guess you answered that already. Leave it?
Leave it. So this is a really good question, and something that in South Africa, a lot of people get very excited about finding these because they are everywhere. And I get a bit militant saying, don't pick it up. I mean, today in the day where everyone has a camera phone, it's super easy. In South Africa, it's illegal to pick up things without a permit. Oh. I mean, people do because you can't stop them, and they're everywhere. But I think the really important thing is don't let it dampen your enthusiasm. Find stuff, but please don't pick it up. Take photos, and it's relatively easy to find regional archaeologists. And I think, they don't want to hear about every single stone tool, but something we're trying to do more in the Tankwa is people have farms and they know their landscapes very well. And it's just a wealth of data that we can then go and go and use. So I'm hoping that next year I can spend some time working with landowners and rangers in the national park and things in the Tanqua Karoo and do a sort of educational, well, this is what this is what that is, and this is what you should do and how you can record it to help us. I mean, it's the basis of citizen science. And it would be nice to kind of, given that we've written this book about the landscape itself and it's got some nice pictures in it, we're hoping that the Tanqua Karoo might be a good starting point for getting local people involved in recording stuff for us.
That would be a good idea.
Yeah.
People, don't pick anything up, take a picture, it has coordinates, and go.
And if you've got something for a scale, put a coin or a pen or a something in with it and take pictures from multiple angles, because just what you think might be the interesting bit doesn't necessarily give us the most information as an analyst. But I think a lot of archaeologists will, maybe not all, but many are always keen to talk to people about things they found. You know, it's what got us all into it in the first place. We were all the children playing in the dirt, looking at rocks or pots or bones. So yeah, it's good to be reminded of that kind of quest for knowledge, the curiosity of it.
Yeah, I wish I knew when I was a child, because my dad and I used to go to these old medieval castles and I would always look for bones and then bring them home with me. I was like 8 years old and that was my hobby. So
but your parents loved that.
My dad was like, ew, but yeah, cool, Victoria. All right, moving on. Let's do the Hayes quick takes. These are rapid fire questions. Just answer spontaneously. What got you interested in lithics?
I actually hated lithics when I finished my undergrad. It was an opportunity that was offered to me by the professor I worked with in South Africa. And it was the gateway to doing my own research. So I kind of haven't looked back. It was very different experiencing them out in the field than sitting in a very nice museum in Cambridge looking at amazing rocks that now I'm so delighted I got to see. But at the time, it was all a bit confusing and overwhelming.
What's a hobby of yours outside of science?
I have many hobbies, probably too many, but it's good to keep distracted from things. I like to bake, I like to do craft, I run, I used to sing in a choir, I briefly worked at a gin distillery.
What? A gin distillery?
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that hobby before. Oh, that's a lot, Emily. How do you have time for everything?
I ask myself the same question.
So then what's one thing about your job that people often misunderstand or don't know?
Ooh. I guess it's that we only spend a very small amount of our time in the field. Most of the work we do, aside from all the admin and stuff like that, but it's the amount of time that one has to spend thinking, and there's only so much thinking you have time for in the field. And so often, you know, you have two weeks or something, and it's only a month later where you think, damn, I wish I'd done that, or if I'd only had thought of that at the time. So there's a lot of thinking about the big picture, obviously reading and writing and all these things. But I think, yeah, a lot of people must think that we just... And the other thing, that not all archaeologists dig holes. As we've discussed, surface archaeology, there's so much that exists out on the landscape without digging a hole.
What do you collect? Like
pretty rocks, not artifacts, but I collect nice rocks.
I did too. If you had to switch professions, what would you do?
Probably open a gin distillery.
I'd come visit.
It's my not even joking second career option for when I'm done with academia. I mean, the job market and so on isn't really in our favour. So yeah, I will open a gin distillery. Don't know where yet, but you can all come and buy my gin.
I would. If you had a link, I'd put it in the show notes as well. A country you'd like to visit but never have been to?
Egypt. But hopefully I'm going in January of next year. Oh. I'm very excited. As a child who, like many children, wanted to be an Egyptologist. And we're working in the Valley of the Kings, but I'm looking at stone tools, my current passion. So childhood Emily is jumping up and down for joy, and adult Emily is also just can't wait to get there.
Mountains or beaches?
Mountains.
For a relaxing day off. Mountains?
Mountains.
Yeah, same. I get that. Do you like the snow? It's snowing quite heavily here for Vienna and like the beginning of December.
It's been quite fun to go out. I've been staying with friends who have children, and we went out and we were all being children in the snow, which was great fun. It's totally different from Faro, where it really doesn't feel like Christmas with palm trees and sun. It's very nice, but it's not Christmassy. So it's been really lovely to absorb some Christmas spirit here, and the snow is just tops it all off.
It's lovely. If you could time travel to any period, where and when would it be?
I guess I have that curiosity about wanting to know what the people were doing at the site that I know so well. But also, I don't know whether I'd want to know, because that sort of takes away part of the fun of what we do as researchers and why we work in prehistory. If we wanted to know what people from their own lips what they were doing, we'd work in history, not prehistory. So it's a tricky one. I think I'd have to park that for now. There's either too many questions or not enough.
Yeah, I get that. Also, some people say never meet your idols. You could maybe you would be disappointed, and we don't want that. So let's move to our last segment called Speakers Ask Speakers. That's where each guest leaves a question for the upcoming one. And this time our question is, what's the most fascinating aspect of your work?
I think certainly in the way that my research has taken me outside of Africa in the last couple of years, it's looking at how, and in particular the technology that I'm studying, I'm looking at how people made stone tools using a particular method in multiple different parts of the world in several different time periods. And I think it's made me think a lot about what are the underlying patterns in human behavior, and seeing very similar looking artifacts in vastly different places and different times, and actually thinking why were people doing it this way and not another way. And it's that sort of, I don't know that my research will ever answer this question, but it's amazing to be able to hold these artifacts in my hand, to scan them, and actually kind of experience the similar things that people were doing in different places.
All right, Emily, and last but not least, where can people find you online?
So I have an Instagram page at Tanqua Rocks. I have a website, emilyhallinan.com, and that's where you can also find information about the time trackers. And I'm also on Twitter.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today and for coming to the HEAS podcast, Emily.
Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome to the HEAS podcast, Ainash. We're so excited to have you here today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm really excited because, let me say, I looked you up and I was just so impressed by all the things you've done and the places you've traveled to conduct research and just your journey overall.
Thank you.
So could you please introduce yourself and your research to our listeners?
So my name is Ainash. Currently, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Kansas in the anthropology department. I'm also a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany. And
so cool. I'm so impressed.
And so my work currently is primarily focused on doing ancient DNA, and I have worked in kind of more population genetics field where we look at DNA from bones or teeth from various humans in the past, and we try to figure out who they were and who they were related to, what kind of groups they lived in, who they mixed with. So one of these projects that I've done before was looking at the first European farmers, so the people who are the ancestors of the farmers in Anatolia in the Near East who migrated to Europe like 8,000 years ago, and then how they brought with them this technology of farming, and they kind of intermixed with the local hunter-gatherers, so they gave rise to this the first kind of farming population of Europe. And what's interesting is we don't see this like mingling with the local hunter-gatherers so much in the beginning, but further as we go through this time period, which is called Neolithic, then we start seeing this intensification. So they are in the beginning kind of not really reproducing with the hunter-gatherers, but then later on they're having more close relationships, which is interesting to me. And yeah,
it's really interesting. What kind of time period are we talking about where they are not really in contact with one another? How long?
So that would be from kind of more in the early Neolithic, so about 8,500 BC to kind of 8,000, beginning of the 7,000s, that they're not as much interacting, but then later on in the Middle Neolithic, we see more of the interaction. So, and we do it based on what's called admixture proportions. So we see like the proportions of the different ancestries where we can say, okay, this in the early Neolithic, they were, 95% early farmer, maybe 5% a hunter-gatherer ancestry. Then going to the Middle Neolithic, we say, oh, now they're 80% early farmer and 20% hunter-gatherer. So there's more happening.
Okay, so you can bioinformatically trace back
Yeah.
how much ancestry, which population contributed
Yeah.
through ancient DNA.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I've also seen that you've completed a joint PhD at the University of Michigan of Public Health and Biological Anthropology. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's such a unique intersection. I've never met somebody like that before. So can you share how these two fields intertwine in your research?
Yeah, so it was a bit of an accident how it happened, mainly based on the type of research I was doing. So I was interested in, back then, looking at high altitude adaptation from the perspective of epigenetics, so looking at DNA methylation. And the population that I was studying was from the Andes. So these are Peruvian, indigenous Peruvian individuals who live high up in the Andes, but in a lot of Andean towns, historically, there's also a lot of kind of mining for heavy metals. So you have these populations who live in these really high altitude places. So in case of the location where I worked, which is called Cerro de Pasco, it was at 4,300 meters above sea level. So that's pretty high. But it's also a mine. It used to be a silver mine in the past. Then the silver ran out. Then they started just mining heavy metals. And we know that heavy metals have an effect on the epigenome, which is why I was interested in kind of looking at this joint exposure of hypoxia, which comes from living at high altitude, and heavy metals from like being exposed to like lead and other metals.
Oh, wow. So a lot of your work is focused on epigenetics, but could you please explain to us what epigenetics is and how it's different from normal genetics?
So epigenetics, when the definition itself is epi means above, so it's kind of like above genetics. And what it means is the changes to the DNA that do not affect the sequence of the nucleotides. So you have the nucleotides, the A, C, T, and G, and they stay the same, but then how the DNA is packaged, because it is really tightly packaged in our cells, can change. So there are parts of the genome that can be more packed or less packed, and this packaging affects how accessible they are to to be able to then be made into proteins.
And you said the sequence, bless you, the sequence itself is not being changed. You accumulate epigenetic modifications throughout your whole lifetime.
Yeah.
But can you then also, can they be inherited from your mom and your dad?
That's an open question. I think they're to a big degree no, because there's epigenetic reprogramming that happens at fertilization. So the egg and the sperm, they have their own epigenomes. And when they merge, the epigenomes are removed and the new epigenome of the fetus is, established. So in that time, usually kind of the theory is that any exposures of the mother are affecting the child. So they are inheriting the environment of the mother or the father. But the paternal influence would be more during puberty, when the sperm cells, when the sperm is maturing. But for the maternal, it would be more in the early development. So they are inherited in a way that you inherit the environment of your parents, like you inherit the diet of your parents often, the culture of your parents. But so in that sense, not directly, a bit indirectly.
Indirectly. So there are many more levels to inherit something than just pure genetic.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating. And as you've mentioned before, you've done a lot of impressive research all over the world.
Thank you.
You mentioned your high altitude work in Peru. And also I've read that you were exploring the impacts of early developmental stress on Romanian children. Then you also published data from Mount Everest Base Camp regarding DNA methylation in relation to also high altitude. Is there a project that specifically stood out to you?
I really liked doing the Everest work, the base camp Everest work, because it was just fun. The project came out to be because I was invited to come with this group of students, with the professors, and they were doing a class. It was a study abroad type class, and they had to hike to the base camp of the Everest, and we were collecting measurements of ourselves, pretty much. So it was a group of, I think, 20 to 30 people, I don't remember. And we were collecting, urine, blood, physiological measurements to see how people are changing or adapting to this environment. And my idea was that we also we collected saliva and we collected blood spots for methylation analysis, because then we could combine these different types of data to see if the physiological change is then also having correlating with like an epigenetic change.
It's so interesting that you picked that project, because one of our followers wrote in and asked you about that. Let me just find that quickly. It says in one of your papers, you state that your team got study participants to hike up Mount Everest.
Yeah.
So basically the participants were you and a group of students.
We were the participants.
And the question continues, how do you get people to sign up for something like that? And did they at least receive any sort of goodie bag or reward at the end?
Well, they were part of a study. I think that's fun. And
definitely pretty cool.
But the cool part was experiencing it, doing the Everest Base Camp hike is actually amazing, because you are in a very beautiful area and you see a big change in the environment. So you go from a more lower altitude. So the hike starts at about 2,000 meters above sea level. And there, you hike through forests, you hike through beautiful areas. At 3,000, you're above tree lines. There are no trees anymore. And then you're hiking on Mars. There's just really small plants and then small bushes. And at some point, you just also push yourself.
Yeah.
Like what you can do, because when you start hiking above 4,500, then you are going really slow. You're feeling your every beat of your heart, because it's really hard to get enough oxygen, and it's hard on the body. But in their case, they were lucky. They were exercise department students, so they were very fit.
Oh, that definitely helps, right?
But I think just the whole experience of that is really cool.
It sounds insane. Really, really cool. All right. So let's get back to one of my questions, because I was really, really intrigued by all the stuff you do. I'm also an anthropologist, but with your connection also to public health is really something
cool.
unique. Yeah. So when I was growing up, I just wish I would have seen more badass female scientists like you. No, really, because for several reasons, because simply the representation, of a female scientist, and just the notion that we can have it all. And I think it's so important, especially as a female scientist, to perform also outreach, and act as a role model, especially to young girls. And I think it impacts them more than we might think, or even themselves, they might think. So did you have any role models growing up?
Role models, I think, yes. Definitely my grandmas were my role models growing up. I grew up very close to both of them. And one of my grandmas actually was a doctor. And she's still alive. She just doesn't practice anymore. But she, I grew up in Kazakhstan, so in the Soviet Union time. And so she was a head of a lab that did testing of like different blood values at a hospital. And I remember as a child, she would take me with her to like look around and to just see. And I think that had an impact, because then, you're exposed to it already at an early age. And then you kind of see it and you see that it's not foreign, which I think for where it really matters, having the exposure and having for people the ability to go and experience these things and having specific programs. And actually, I'm part of a group called the Stepsisters. It's a networking organization in, I would say, Central Eurasia. So it's for women and underrepresented groups in the region who work in the region or are from there. And what we do is we have mentoring opportunities. We also have like early career conferences. We had one in Uzbekistan in Tashkent. 2 years ago now, and we're planning another one this summer in Kazakhstan. So
that's really cool.
yeah, I'm now applying for funding. I'm trying to plan it, and yeah, I'm really excited about that.
Well, good luck.
Thank you.
Maybe you can share some like insights then afterwards with us.
Yeah, I would love
that
to.
Would be cool.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the second follow-up questions that I noted. I read that you are a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute and a tenure-track assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Kansas. One question, how?
Well,
I love that one.
The postdoc is, I'm phasing that out a bit. So
Yeah.
then I have a smaller involvement where, most of my time now is spent, in the US being a professor. But still, I like having the connection with the Max Planck Institute and, to continue working on these projects. But I would say that it's it's not easy going from one country to another, going back and forth. But I think that's the fun part of being a scientist who travels a lot and then being able to work in different cultures. And I would say that having this connection has really helped me too. Kind of seeing how academia is on the American side versus the European side. You see the differences, you see the different systems. So it's also kind of very educational in a way.
Let's move on to the Hea's Quick Takes, which is a segment where I'm asking you rapid fire questions. So just answer with the first spontaneous thing that comes to your head. If I would give you a plane ticket right now, where would it go to?
Kazakhstan.
The most interesting food you've tried during your travels?
I mean, I've tried guinea pig in Peru.
How was that?
It was like chicken. Yeah.
Would you do it again?
Yeah.
All right. I used to have guinea pigs as a child, so I'm not sure. I probably would try to.
Yeah.
Biggest mess up or incident at work?
Biggest mess up at work. I mean, I don't know if it's a mess up or something, but at one point, it's also going to be kind of boring. But at one point, I bought these kits from a company to look at methylation, these arrays. And at one point, the company, in the middle of a project, they came up with a new edition. And then we had to buy, and they sent us the kits that were half of them were one edition, half of them the other edition. And then I was looking at the data and I was like, okay, I could see that they're separating based on the kit. That's not supposed to happen.
Not fun.
Yeah, there were some calls on the phone with the company to try and figure out what can be done. In the end, they just replaced everything. So they sent another batch of new kits of all the same kits, luckily this time, and it fixed it. But there was a time when I was like, well, my PhD work is, in trouble.
I feel you. I feel you. We had a similar situation going on. And of course, I mean, they're replacing it. Thanks, I guess. But then the time lost and also sequencing costs, if you've already sequenced a bunch of stuff, is like, well, a different story.
Yeah.
All right. What are you currently reading?
Currently, I usually read multiple books. Currently, I'm listening to a book called Educated. It's by this woman in the US called Tara. I forgot her last name, but it's about a woman who grew up in this Mormon survivalist cult, or not cult, family in Idaho, I think. And it's how she didn't go to school, and it's how I'm just in the beginning, but in the story she ends up going to school at 17, and how this kind of changes her life, and this education changes her life.
Boy,
yeah.
These stories, I read a bit about Mormons, and it's really intense and so different from...
So they're a big family with a lot of children, and the kids didn't go to school, but then some of them eventually went to college. And
sounds interesting. We'll have to take a note. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
What's next in your career?
Well, the tenure track. So then, getting tenure is the next thing. So now I starting my new position at the University of Texas in Austin in January. And then, just
Wow.
working towards that. I think then the next, I guess, 6 years are going to be really trying to achieve this goal.
All the best for
Yeah.
that, really.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a segment that is called Speakers Ask Speakers, where each speaker leaves a question for the upcoming one.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our speakers left you this question. If you could travel through time, what era would you like to visit? And which mythological or historical character would you like to meet?
Wow, that's a great question. I think I would actually be more interested in kind of more deeper prehistory of like the time of hunter-gatherers, because to me it's interesting, what languages did they speak?
Yeah.
How did they even perceive of other groups? I feel like we live in such a global community now that it's easier for us to envision, difference and people speaking other languages. But if you're a group of hunter-gatherers, living somewhere in Eurasia 10,000 years ago, like what was your vision of the world? I think. And the character that I would meet, I don't know. There's this woman, who's a shaman lady of Germany, from Bad Dürrenberg. I think she's about 10,000 years ago. So I would meet her. She was a pretty cool figure. Was buried with very elaborate objects. And
That was the very, very cool burial with the ornaments and all that stuff, right? Maybe I can put in the pictures for our listeners.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. And last but not least, where can people find you online?
They can find me on X, former Twitter. I do check it from time to time, but generally, email, I would say. Yeah.
Okay, I'll put your Twitter in the show notes below.
Yeah.
Ainash, thank you so much for sitting down with me today for the HEAS podcast.
Thank you, Victoria.
Stefano, and welcome to the HEAS podcast. Could you please introduce yourself and your field of expertise to our listeners?
Of course, I would be pleased. First of all, I'm very pleased to be in Vienna, and I am an archaeologist. I started originally as a medieval archaeologist, but I always, let's say, spend my experience and develop my experience studying landscapes in a diachronic perspective, which means from the very early beginning, since we can find some evidence of the past, so prehistory through protohistory, and then across time up to the medieval and modern times. My experience, started in the past century, and I wasn't that satisfied with the methodology that I applied during my work of degree. And so starting from the time I tried to make my record better by using new technologies, but also by trying to improve or to better apply some old or traditional approaches to the study of landscapes. So that's more or less, I would say, my background.
Can you explain why landscape archaeology as a whole is important?
In my view, is one of the reasons is that, for instance, within the academia, only landscape archaeologists are interested in the understanding of the past as a whole, because one of the issues is, within the academia there are prehistoric archaeologists, Roman archaeologists, or classical archaeologists, medieval archaeologists. So, everybody is studying different pieces of the landscapes and of the time and the history of humanity. But what is really peculiar, I would say, and fundamental within landscape archaeology is the observation of the landscape and of the past as a whole, as a continuum. Dividing different periods is just something that we do for reasons that are not historical reasons. Is arbitrary to a certain extent. So I think that the understanding of landscape is particularly fascinating because of that, and is also very, very important because past landscapes are disappearing. New development are transforming landscapes, and climate change and many other threats are affecting archaeology and, generally speaking, the memory of the past. So we are losing day after day big pieces of memory, and which means also, piece of our identity. So I think that is so archaeology, and particularly I would say landscape archaeology is something very contemporary. Is something that we really need in our present society.
As you mentioned, it's like you're working against time almost, because one of our follower questions, I'm going to jump to that right now because it fits. One of our followers asked, isn't it getting harder and harder to identify archaeological landscapes with the increasing numbers of buildings that are, popping up, and with agricultural fieldwork like plowing? Absolutely.
Agriculture is, without any doubt, the worst and the biggest player within the destruction of archaeological evidence. Because, plowing and agriculture, generally speaking, it happens almost everywhere, is definitely necessary. We are not saying that it's not necessary, but however, intensive agriculture, modern agriculture has a terrifying impact on archaeology, on the past. And for instance, from this point of view, before I was telling about new technologies that, of course, are helping very much our capability to understand the past. But as in Vienna, you are masters in aerial photography. Historical aerial photographies are so important because, there is the opportunity to see a landscape that disappeared, landscapes that are completely changed. If you think about the suburbs of Vienna, of Paris, of Berlin, of Rome, after World War II, everything changed completely. So huge, big developments completely transformed the countryside and the landscape, but also, of course, also rural areas has been strongly transformed. And so, it is a challenge, definitely.
Let's go into aerial pictures and that method, because you mentioned that pictures taken before the cities have expanded. And there's also a lot of construction sites, like when they built railroads, whatever. But before that all happened, I read about a paper, I have to be honest, that was talking about Cold War satellite images that revealed hundreds of unknown Roman forts. These were actually spy pictures. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. In particular, there were two programs. One was Soviet, and the other was the US. They collected a massive amount of pictures, but most of them are not associated with Europe. Well, some Eastern European countries, but above all, Syria, Iraq, some Turkey. And that area, Afghanistan, well, some very hot areas of the Middle East, and all those pictures are now and since many years available because it's been declassified. So starting from 1995. Has been declassified, and above all, the American spy program, most of the pictures are now available on the Arkansas University website. There is an atlas, which is an amazing resource because are not just available as aerial photographies, but has been rectified, georeferenced. So that means that you can download the aerial photography, the satellite imagery, and upload in your GIS. So are an incredible, useful resource. And as you said, are amazing because most of that pictures has been collected in the 60s and 70s when those countries were still development has still to happen. In our places, let's say in Western countries, it is a bit different because we have lots of aerial photographies that has been collected, since at least, after World War II, but even before, and were collected mainly for mapping purpose. So there are lots of archives with aerial photographies that are definitely better than satellite imagery. But however, if you don't have anything else, they are good.
Of course.
And as you said, I mean, lots of archaeological sites has been identified thanks to declassified aerial photographies. Satellite imagery. Yeah.
I recently met an elderly lady and she was very cultured and so interesting. She was interesting and also interested because I told her what I was doing for a job. She was like, oh, I have a bunch of questions. And I was like, okay. And one of the questions she asked me was, how do you decide where to dig? And I wish I would have spoken to you before because I could have given her the answer that we have all these amazing data sources and we have aerial pictures. But I'm going to pass that question on to you, Stefano. How do you decide where to dig?
No, well, this is a very good question, of course. Nowadays I would say that a good habit would be first studying the context, which means you first study the landscape. Archaeological excavation, I think that archaeological excavation is still extremely important and is the most detailed method that we have to get information about the past. But it is also very, very important, as you said, to know where start the excavation, because excavation is very time consuming, is very expensive. So it is very important to start or to excavate areas that are really worth to excavate. We don't have to forget that excavation is destruction of archaeology, so we have a responsibility also with the archaeology that we are going to destroy. So, if we have good questions, if we know why we are doing that, starting excavation where we expect to find some answer from. So this is, I would say, a good process to follow.
That's definitely one approach that you have to consider, like all the history embedded and what you know about the area, and then you expect to find something. But other than maybe, like, let's focus on methods, other than these aerial pictures, what else is there? Can you scan the ground?
Well, yes, of course. Yeah. I didn't go into the detail, but however, as you said, aerial photographies, of course, can be extremely useful. We have lots of methodology nowadays, so we can scan the soil, we can scan the ground through, for instance, ground-penetrating radar, through magnetic survey, through electricity, so electrical tomography. Are all different methods, and there are also some other methods, but I would say that these are the most relevant and most successful, that are usually most successful. And what is also important is that one of the issues is that we don't have, let's say, the perfect method. Unfortunately, not always GPRs or ground penetrating method or magnetic survey works. So the best approach is to use at least two of them. I always do to my students the parallel with scanning the human body and looking for healthy issue and so on. There is not just one method, there are different methods. But another point that is very important is that you have to know, you need questions, because if you don't have questions, it's very difficult to find any evidence. Think also, continuing the parallel with the human body, you need to look for something, which it doesn't mean that maybe you are finding something different or something more, but it is very important to start from some questions, of course.
Yeah, if we use the analogy with the human body, it's like you run a couple of tests, but you probably go in with a hypothesis that could either come out true or false, but then you do tests, and there is something like a test excavation before you really go for it.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I like the analogy.
Absolutely.
Okay, I hope that lady is listening to the podcast. I don't think so, but here she gets all the answers. Let's move to another follow-up question that I collected. This person is saying, I'm a student interested in archaeology. Any advice for someone just starting in the field?
Oh yeah, why not? Archaeology is, I think, is a pretty peculiar subject, because I think that it is very important to study, of course, to follow lecture and to get, let's say, a very good theoretical education. But at the same time, there are pieces and part of the archaeological activity that you need to do field work. You need to, and in any case, also if you will specialize in something that is not dealing, for instance, with archaeological excavation. I think that is very important to have a experience on archaeological excavation. In any case, I mean, field work is a very important piece of the education of an archaeologist. Then, of course, now archaeology is becoming more and more complex. There are more and more specialization, and we need to get in the idea that we are not talking about archaeologists. We are talking about team of archaeologists. It is really, I would say, anachronistic to think about, I mean, the archaeologist that knows everything and that is managing
broad.
the whole process. So it doesn't work like that anymore. Maybe there are some people that think that it's working like that, but the complexity is growing and growing, and I don't think that this model is working anymore.
And the more you learn, the more you will understand and see how little you actually know. It's a process, but you can specialize. As you said, it's very complex. There's a bunch of different fields of expertise that you could pick from. Yeah. So in total, studying archaeology, 1 out of 10, would you recommend? How many points would you give it? For this person?
11, probably.
Oh, okay.
11. I think that we need archaeologists. We need more archaeologists.
All right, so start your studies and then get back to us. Let's move on to our HEAS quick takes. These are rapid fire questions. I told you before. Just answer from the heart.
Yeah, let's see. I don't think that I'm particularly good in this kind of things, but let's see.
I would be terrible at that. Let's just dive into it. Are you a morning person or a nighttime person?
Oh, no. I'm a night person.
I get the feeling many researchers are.
Probably.
Favorite country to travel to?
Oh, well, I just like to travel. And also from this point of view, being an archaeologist is the right work. I think that, any country is worth to be visited.
If you could have a dinner party with 3 historical figures, who would they be?
Wow. Well, one for sure is Brodel. Another one, I would like to have a dinner with my mentor, who's died unfortunately. So I would like to have a dinner with him too. Well, Caesar for sure.
Right, I didn't think that far back, but
probably also Romolo, why not? Could be an interesting character.
The more you think about it, the more people probably will come up. So, the strangest animal encounter during field expeditions.
And I was a bit annoyed from a snake in Iraq that was in our place. I found in... I don't like that much snakes. I'm very fascinated but I don't like to find in my room.
They're good to look at from afar.
Yeah, definitely.
Wait, did you say it was in your room?
Not in my bedroom, but it was in this place where we lived.
Yeah, that's close enough.
And the interesting point was that I asked the Iraqi people, but is that venomous? And they told me, yes, of course. All the snakes in the desert are venomous, are highly venomous. So, okay.
Thanks. Thanks for the info. Any rituals before an excavation starts?
To be fair, the only thing that, every time that I start an excavation, I'm really scared. Lots of anxiety.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Which is also...
I'm scared from... Not because I don't trust, but,
I understand, really. I can feel that.
It's a responsibility.
It is. So, and then last one, stranded on an island, 3 things you'd want with you.
On an island. Well, probably this is pretty unpopular, but I would like to have my wife and my family.
Why is that unpopular? That's the best answer.
I don't know why, but yeah, I would like to have my family. And
then to make your daughter happy, you got to bring the cats?
No, the cats, no, please. But yeah, of course. And then, of course, they are going to decide the rest, the other 2 things. Because
I like
if
that
they
answer.
come along, they will decide for the other 2 things.
Good. Let's end on that note with the HEAS quick takes. Then I have another segment that's called Speakers Ask Speakers. I ask every guest that sits down with us to provide a question for the next speaker. And I brought one for you today as well. The question says, what other completely different academic field do you sometimes wish you had pursued instead?
Architecture. It is also very interesting because you can have a strong influence, hopefully positive, on people, on lifestyle, on habits, and so I think it's a very fascinating field. In any case, whatever was architecture at a certain point became archaeology. So.
Exactly. And last but not least, where can people find you online? Do you have a website, or would you like to provide your social media handles?
Yeah. I have a website. Do you need the address? Yeah.
You can say it. I'm definitely going to put it in our show notes below.
Okay.
So if people want to reach out to you, it would be via your website, and probably your email address is on there.
Yeah. My email address is absolutely the best. Is campana at unic.it. So unic is University of Siena. Of course, I will be pleased to answer or to stay in touch with anybody is sending an email. Of course, absolutely.
That's very kind of you. Okay, so to wrap this up, Stefano, thank you so much for sitting down with us for the HEAS podcast today.
You're welcome.
Hello again, Victoria here. If you enjoyed this episode or the podcast in general, please consider showing us your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast on Spotify and YouTube. Your feedback and engagement mean the world to us and keep us going. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and stay tuned for the next episode of the HEAS podcast.